Drive from Oakville to downtown Hamilton takes about 40 minutes on a good day. That morning, it took me 32. My daughter called me at 6:47. I heard it in the first syllable, not words, just that particular collapse in her voice that I hadn't heard since she was 9 years old and fell off the dock at the cottage. I didn't ask questions. I told her I was already putting on my coat. She was standing outside Union Station with my grandson on her hip and a single carry-on at her feet. 7 years of marriage, and that was everything she'd brought with her. My grandson was wearing his pajama top tucked into jeans. Someone had dressed him in a hurry. I pulled up to the curb and got out of the car. She looked at me the way people look when they'd been holding themselves together with nothing but sheer will, and then someone they trust finally shows up. "Get in," I said. "We'll talk when he's asleep." She didn't argue. She strapped my grandson into the back seat. He was 4, still young enough to fall asleep in a moving car if you kept the radio low, and she sat in the front and stared at the QEW the whole drive back. I didn't push her. I know my daughter. She needed to say it on her own terms. It wasn't until we were in my kitchen and I had a cup of tea in front of her that she finally looked at me. "She fired me," she said. "From the company, from the house. She told me I was a liability to the family name and that my son would be better raised by people who understood their position." I wrapped both hands around my own mug. "And your husband?" I said. She looked down at the table. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. That told me everything. My daughter had married into the Ashworth family 6 years before. Gerald Ashworth Sr. had built a mid-size construction and property management company out of Burlington. Nothing flashy, but solid. Commercial leases, some residential development along the Niagara Escarpment, a few contracts with the region of Halton. When he died, his son took over. My son-in-law, Bryce, was not a bad man the way some men are bad. He was weak the way some men are weak, which, in the end, does the same damage. His mother, Constance, was another matter entirely. Constance Ashworth had spent 30 years building an identity around that company and that family name. She sat on the board of a local heritage foundation. She was photographed every spring at the Rotary Club Gala. She spoke at her Anglican church about community and values with the kind of fluency that only comes from never having been questioned. She wore cream-colored blazers. She called my daughter by her first name exactly twice in 6 years of marriage, once at the wedding, once when she wanted my daughter to chair a fundraising committee she didn't want to chair herself. The rest of the time she called her Bryce's wife. My daughter had gone to work for Ashworth Property Management 3 years into the marriage. She was good at it. She has a mind for contracts, for the fine print, for the clause buried on page 14 that everyone else skims over. Constance had pushed for it actually. She said it would be good for family cohesion. What she meant was, she wanted someone she could direct, someone whose performance review she controlled, someone who couldn't afford to say no. For 3 years, my daughter did the work and absorbed the comments, the gentle corrections at family dinners, the suggestions always framed as concern that maybe she was spreading herself too thin, that perhaps her priorities were becoming unclear. The time Constance told Bryce's youngest sister, loudly enough to be heard from the next room, that ambition in a woman was an attractive quality, but only up to a point. I knew some of this. Not all of it. My daughter is not a complainer. She comes from a long line of women who believed that holding your head up was more useful than holding a grudge, which is true, but sometimes people confuse that with permission to keep adding weight. The morning Constance called her into the office and handed her a termination letter, formal, typed, with a clause about non-disclosure, Bryce was already in the room. He had known it was coming. He had not warned her. The letter said her position had been restructured for operational efficiency. The real reason was delivered verbally, the way powerful people deliver things they don't want written down. My daughter had questioned a lease agreement. She had found an irregularity in a property contract on King Street East, and she had put it in writing and sent it up the chain. Constance had not appreciated that. Not the finding. and not the paper trail. When my daughter tried to call me from the parking lot, Constance had already spoken to the daycare. My grandson was brought home to the Ashworth house in Waterdown. My daughter drove there and Bryce met her at the door and told her very quietly that perhaps it was best if she stayed somewhere else while things settled. My grandson was inside, she could hear him. She stood on that front step in November and she did not cry. She told me this later and I believed her because I know where she gets it from. She went to a hotel on Plains Road. She sat in that room for 6 hours before she called me. I think she needed those 6 hours to decide that asking for help was not the same as losing. She was right. It isn't. But I understand why it took 6 hours. Now, here is what Constance Ashworth did not know. She did not know that 22 years earlier, when Gerald Sr. was first expanding his company's footprint along the escarpment, he had come to my late husband looking for investment capital. My husband, Desmond, was not a flashy man either. He was an accountant from Dundas who had spent 30 years making careful decisions and keeping his name out of anything that made noise. Gerald Sr. needed a private backer for a land purchase outside of Milton, a parcel of just over 40 acres that he intended to develop in phases. Desmond put in $400,000. In exchange, he received a 22% stake in that specific parcel and a seat on the subsidiary holding company that owned it. Gerald Sr. died without ever developing that parcel fully. Bryce inherited the company and the headaches and the ambitions, but he inherited them through the main corporate entity. The subsidiary, Houghton Escarpment Holdings, Inc., was a separate structure. Constance was not a director. She was not even aware of its full shareholder list. The corporate filings were done through a law office in Hamilton that had been handling our family's affairs since before my daughter was born. When Desmond died 8 years ago, that stake passed to me. I had never mentioned it to my daughter. There was no reason to. It was a dormant investment, a parcel that had sat zoned agricultural for 2 decades while Bryce focused on his urban commercial portfolio. It was not something that came up at Christmas dinners. But 4 months before Constance handed my daughter that termination letter, Bryce had finally moved on the Milton parcel. A logistics company from Mississauga had approached Ashworth about a long-term ground lease for a distribution facility. The numbers were significant. The deal required a unanimous shareholder resolution from Houghton Escarpment Holdings, Inc. I received the notice by registered mail. I read it carefully. I set it on my kitchen table, and I made a pot of coffee. And I thought for a long time about what kind of woman I wanted to be in this situation. I called my lawyer in Hamilton. Then I called a commercial real estate solicitor she recommended, a woman who had spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of work. Then I called my daughter's number and did not leave a message. I did not sign the resolution. Nothing dramatic, no letters, no announcements. I simply did not return the signed documentation. Under the terms of the shareholder agreement which Gerald Sr. had drafted in the straightforward manner of a man who never imagined his own family would become the complication, a resolution of this kind required unanimous consent. Without my signature, the ground lease with the Mississauga company could not proceed. The logistics company had a deadline. They had already begun site assessments. I waited. I want to be honest about something. I was not certain I was doing the right thing. There were nights in those first few weeks when I lay awake and thought about Desmond and whether he would have handled this differently. He was a gentler person than I am in some ways, more patient. He believed very sincerely that most problems resolved themselves if you gave them enough time and enough quiet. But Desmond also raised our daughter to know her worth. And I had watched a woman systematically dismantle that knowledge, piece by piece, over 6 years, and then take her grandchild and hand her a legal document and tell her she was not enough. Some things don't resolve themselves. The night my daughter told me what had happened, I made up the bed in the back room, and I went and sat in my reading chair for a while before I slept. I thought about timing. I thought about what I actually wanted the outcome to be. I did not want to destroy anything. I wanted my grandson in his mother's arms on a regular basis. I wanted my daughter's work, All of it, the contracts, the irregularities she'd found, the years, to be acknowledged. I wanted Bryce to be required to make a choice with consequences attached to it, rather than a choice that cost him nothing. The following week, I had my lawyer send a formal letter to Ashworth Property Management advising them that I had retained legal counsel in connection with the Halton Escarpment Holdings resolution, and that I wished to schedule a meeting with the shareholders to discuss the terms of my participation going forward. The response came from Constance's personal lawyer. It was polite and somewhat confused in tone. I don't think she had fully processed who I was in relation to this company. I had been, from her perspective, simply Bryce's wife's mother. A woman from Dundas. Someone who brought squares to Christmas dinner and asked after the grandchildren. My lawyer replied with the full documentation of my shareholder position and a copy of the original investment agreement from 22 years prior. Then she outlined, in precise and unhurried language, the specific provisions that required my consent for the logistics deal to proceed, the timeline pressure the company was currently under, and my clients wished to discuss the matter in person before any further steps were taken. I am told Constance did not respond well to this letter. I am told she spent some time on the phone with 3 different people before she understood that the situation was exactly what it appeared to be. We met on a Thursday afternoon in the boardroom of Ashworth Property Management on John Street North. The building is a converted Victorian, original brick, good bones, the kind of thing that photographs well for a company that wants to signal permanence. I had been in that building exactly once before, for a company Christmas party 3 years earlier, when I had stood near the cheese board and watched my daughter refill other people's glasses. Bryce was there. His personal lawyer was there. Constance was there, in a cream blazer, and she looked at me with the careful expression of someone recalibrating. My daughter was not there. I had not told her about this meeting. I had my reasons. My lawyer opened by stating my position clearly. I held 22% of Halton Escarpment Holdings, Inc. The logistics ground lease required my consent. My consent was not currently forthcoming, but I was open to discussion. What I was not open to was a transaction that would benefit the Ashworth Company significantly while my daughter remained subject to a non-disclosure agreement, while my grandson's custody arrangement was informal and unenforceable, and while an internal financial irregularity my daughter had identified in good faith remained unaddressed. I watched Bryce during this. He looked at the table. He looked at his mother. He did not look at me. Constance spoke carefully. She said that the situation regarding her daughter-in-law was a family matter and had no bearing on a corporate transaction. She said it with the confidence of someone who had said things like this before and had them accepted. My lawyer said that my client agreed completely. The corporate matter and the family matter were entirely separate. My client simply happened to have interests in both spheres, and she hoped to see both spheres reach a satisfactory resolution before she committed her signature to anything. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to count the original pressed tin tiles on the ceiling. There are 47 of them in that boardroom. I had time to count. Constance asked what exactly I was proposing. My lawyer set a document on the table. It was not a demand. It was a proposal. It outlined a formal parenting agreement, drafted with a family lawyer, giving my daughter shared custody with a structured schedule and written protocols for decision-making. It outlined a severance review, not litigation, just a review, conducted by an independent HR consultant of the termination circumstances. It outlined the removal of the non-disclosure clause as it applied to my daughter's description of her own employment history. And it outlined a formal acknowledgement that the internal audit finding my daughter had submitted would be referred to the company's external accountants. Nothing punitive, nothing designed to take anything away. Just the minimum conditions under which my daughter could stand on ground that was actually level. Bryce picked up the proposal. He read the first 2 pages. He put it down. He looked at his mother. She was still looking at me. "You've been planning this," she said. "I've been patient," I said. "I've been patient," I said. It was the first time I spoke directly in that meeting. There's a difference. She didn't respond to that. I don't think she had a response ready for it. The meeting ended without signatures from anyone, but when my lawyer and I walked out onto John Street and the November air hit us, my lawyer said she expected to hear something within 10 days. She was right. It was 7. Bryce called me himself. He did not call through lawyers. He called on a Sunday morning and I was in my kitchen and I let it ring twice before I picked up. He sounded tired in a way I recognized. Not the tiredness of overwork, but the tiredness of having finally let go of something heavy. He said he wanted to do right by his son. He said he thought his mother had gone too far. He said he was sorry, and he said my daughter's name, her full name, for the first time in what I suspected was a long time. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him my lawyer would be in touch. I told him that doing right by his son meant doing right by the boy's mother, and those two things were not separable, and I hoped he understood that now. He said he did. I don't know if he did. People say things on Sunday mornings that they believe in the moment. But the agreement was signed 3 weeks later. The custody schedule was fair. The severance review resulted in a revised package. The non-disclosure clause was removed. The external accountants found what my daughter had found, and the correction was made quietly, the way these things usually are. No announcement, no apology. Just a line item adjusted in a quarterly filing. I signed the shareholder resolution on a Tuesday in December. The logistics facility is being built now. The ground lease is a good one for both parties. That was never my concern. My daughter came over for dinner the following Saturday and brought my grandson and a bottle of Riesling from Taws, which is made about 20 minutes from where we were sitting. My grandson sat under the kitchen table building something out of measuring cups while we ate. She asked me at some point how long I had known, how long I had been holding this. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Desmond and that parcel outside Milton and a handshake in an office on King Street East and $400,000 written into a shareholder agreement that sat in a filing cabinet for 22 years. Long enough, I said. She looked at me across the table and I saw her face do the thing it does when she is trying not to feel too much at once. Why didn't you just tell me? She said. Because you didn't need saving, I said. You needed time. And then you needed the ground to be level. She was quiet for a moment. Under the table, my grandson made a small sound of satisfaction at whatever he had built. She thought she knew everything about me, my daughter said. She knew what you let her see, I said. That's not the same thing. There is something I have learned in 63 years that I did not understand at 30. The people who move through the world with the most confidence are not always the people with the most power. Sometimes they are simply the people who have never been shown where the real lines are. They speak in meeting rooms and at church socials and over catered lunches as though the shape of things is permanent, as though the ground under their decisions will hold forever. It usually does. Most people never think to check who actually owns it. But sometimes the woman standing near the cheese board has been an accountant's wife for 30 years, and she has learned to read a balance sheet, and she knows the difference between a company and a subsidiary, and she has kept a very clean filing cabinet. And she loves her daughter with the particular fierce quietness of someone who has been waiting a long time to be useful in exactly this way. Constance Ashworth never called me. Not after the meeting. Not after the agreement was signed, not after the external audit. I did not expect her to. Some people are capable of reconsidering. Some people are not. I have made my peace with not knowing which kind she is. What I know is that my grandson spent Christmas morning at my daughter's apartment in Hamilton, and she sent me a video of him opening a wooden train set, and in the background you could hear her laughing at something he said. Real laughing, the kind that doesn't cost anything. I watched it 4 times sitting in my reading chair with my tea. That was enough. That was exactly enough. I still think about that boardroom sometimes. The pressed tin ceiling. The 47 tiles. The way Constance looked at me when she finally understood what she was dealing with. Not with anger, exactly, but with that particular stillness of someone who has just discovered the floor is not where they thought it was. She had spent years building a version of the world in which she was the one who decided things, who stayed and who left, whose name carried weight and whose didn't. And for a long time, that version of the world held, because no one around her had a reason to challenge it. Or the means to. That's how these situations persist, not because the person at the center is always stronger, but because the people they've hurt have been made to feel that speaking up would cost more than staying quiet. My daughter stayed quiet for 6 years. I want to be careful not to frame that as weakness, because it wasn't. It was judgment. She was making calculations every day about what was survivable and what wasn't, about her son and her marriage and her livelihood, and she made the best decisions she could with what she had. That takes a particular kind of endurance that doesn't get named often enough, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that just keeps showing up and doing the work and holding the line even when the line keeps moving. What I've come to understand is that the things we hold on to quietly, our integrity, our records, our careful documentation of what actually happened, have a way of becoming relevant exactly when they need to. I didn't keep Desmond's shareholder agreement out of strategy. I kept it because he was meticulous, and I respected that, and it felt wrong to let it go. I didn't withhold my signature as a weapon. I withheld it because I needed to think. And thinking takes time, and time turned out to be the one thing Constance's deadline didn't have. That's not luck. Or not only luck, it's what happens when a person spends a life paying attention. When you read the documents instead of skimming them. When you ask the second question and the third. When you don't let someone else's confidence convince you that you already know everything you need to know. Bryce was not a cruel person. He was an unexamined one. And that, in its own way, does as much damage. Because unexamined people don't notice what they're allowing until someone puts it in the boardroom document and sets it on the table in front of them. He made a different choice when the cost of the old choice became visible. I'm not sure how much credit that deserves. But I'm also not in the business of deciding how much people deserve. I'm in the business of making sure my daughter can laugh in her own kitchen. What I know is this. The women in my family have never been loud about what we carry. We don't make speeches. We don't perform our strength for people who wouldn't recognize it anyway. We keep clean files, and we pay attention, and we show up when it matters. And we trust that doing things properly, honestly, carefully, with full knowledge of what we're doing and why, eventually produces something real. It doesn't always. I know that. Not every story ends in a signed agreement and a bottle of Taw's Riesling and a grandchild building something under the kitchen table. But this one did. And I think it did because my daughter didn't become what was done to her. She stayed who she was. That's harder than it sounds. And it matters more than anything else I could tell you.